Grateful that I got to take some time to reflect on this tonight. I was thinking about, Holy Saturday in some ways is kind of like an interesting day in Holy Week because I feel like every other day kind of has like a thing or like a huge event that took place on it. So, Thursday's Last Supper, Friday, Jesus died. Obviously, Sunday is when he rose. But nothing really happens on Saturday. And as Adam was talking about, we've been basing our season off of this book the last week. And this text primarily draws from the Gospel of Mark. And the reason why we don't actually have a Mark reading tonight is if you've ever read the Gospel of Mark, you'll know that there's actually no account of the Saturday after Jesus died. Mark goes straight from Jesus dying on the cross straight into after the Sabbath when folks come to anoint the body of Jesus. And so today, as you see from the scriptures, is typically known as like the harrowing of hell, where Jesus was going down and rescuing folks from hell and kind of taking them out of hell. And this idea of rescuing folks from hell, it had a great significance in early Judaism because for early Jewish folks, the hope of the resurrection, it came out of struggle. Early Jewish freedom fighters had given their lives to fight against oppression, and many of them had died very brutally, very violently, and under very dangerous conditions. And the Gospel of Mark, too, was also written right before the first Jewish-Roman War. And so people were kind of anticipating that a lot more people were going to die and that it was going to be a lot more brutal. And so what the resurrection meant, for these folks and what it meant to tell these early community is that Jesus was going down and was rising again and bringing all the folks. It was basically saying that all these people who had previously died and all these people that people were anticipating were going to die would get to enjoy the fruits of something great, and their deaths would not be in vain, and they would be able to really like have the freedom and the justice that they had died fighting for. And so I think as many folks probably know here, I've talked about it before, but I'm Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school. And something that I think about a lot is that when I was taught these stories, and in particular, especially stories about Jesus, I don't really think that they were ever, I didn't have the experience of them being taught like maliciously or like in bad ways as they can be misused, but I certainly learned about them in a pretty disconnected way. I kind of always learned that Jesus was basically like a miracle worker, and all these stories in the gospel, all these things that Jesus said in the gospel, there was never really emphasis on like the conditions that Jesus was up against or what his followers were actually facing, but instead it was just kind of talking about all these kind of miraculous things that he ended up doing, kind of without this context of mass poverty, mass hunger, political oppression. None of that was ever a part of this. But throughout this season, right, as we've been doing these close readings on this 1 week, one thing that I've repeatedly kind of been struck with and that I've been thinking a lot about is the humanness of these stories. And that's actually where I want to focus some of our reflection a little bit tonight, is not actually on Jesus, but actually on the disciples. Because tomorrow on Easter is where we get to talk about the resurrection. But tonight on Holy Saturday, on the Sabbath, I actually think it's about not knowing. I think it's about sitting in the grief and the pain and not knowing how you will ever be able to move forward. As we've studied this season, we've seen the intensity and the scrutiny, the political oppression, the political violence against Jesus and his movement. And now we're here on Holy Saturday, and we're here on the Sabbath, and Jesus has been brutally executed. And in the silence of Mark's gospel, in the silence of the Saturday in Mark's gospel, I think we should think about the silence and the shock that probably just permeated these communities after seeing their leader executed. I mean, can you imagine what they were thinking? Can you imagine how they must have been replaying the last week in their head over and over again, asking the questions, where did it go wrong? Where did I fail? Could it have been stopped? Could I have stopped it? Could we have stopped it? And if you just think about how hopeless it must have felt too, and how big the Roman Empire must have felt, how unstoppable it must have felt for the disciples. They had been building this movement for a long time. And when it came to the most crucial moment, they weren't able to rise up and defeat the Roman Empire as they might have all thought they were going to be able to do. And I think that's probably something that's really familiar to us. I think we all have witnessed and lived through violent and oppressive measures that those in powers have taken either in our community or in communities across the world. And I think we've all had moments of just being silenced and grief and in pain and shock at the suffering around us. And I'm sure many of us have probably looked at the US empire and thought to ourselves, we are never going to be able to defeat this. This is too big. This is too much. They're too powerful. That is probably something that many of us have struggled with before. And I think as organizers, I feel like it's kind of a rite of passage to have the experience of like getting your ass kicked for the first time. Our mentor, Willie Baptist, often talks about the mistake of organizing, where we think that we're going up against a teddy bear, but we're actually going up against a grizzly bear. And I was thinking a lot about this with the story. And I was thinking in my own life a couple years back, when I was doing an organizing drive with homeless folks in Atlanta. I remember having like this initial kind of courage and fire about really throwing down and organizing with folks, but things got messy very quickly and very hard very quickly. And eventually the city slammed down on folks. And when they did slam down, they actually slammed down harder than before we had even started organizing. And that consumed me with guilt for a very long time. And it consumed me with guilt that things seemed to have gotten worse when we took a stand. And I remember feeling really shocked and really frozen with fear at just like the brutality of the system. And I remember in one conversation that I was having with Kristen, while I was holding all the grief at the time, one of the things she said to me is, no one ever thought you were going to end homelessness in Atlanta. But what you can do is you can learn from this and you can grow from it. And then we can go out and we can try again. And I thought about that because with the disciples, I can only imagine that this experience has probably shattered whatever ideas these poor fishermen from the hood, who got organized, knew what they thought they were up against. Because I'm sure after this, now they probably really know what they're up against, and they probably really have a deeper understanding of how brutal what they're fighting against is. And ultimately, as the disciples are paralyzed with grief and are paralyzed with shock, they have two options. They can either succumb to that and they can give up, or they can look at what they've built. They can realize where they fell short. They can reassess the enemy. They can regroup. They can reorganize and move forward. And of course, we all know what option they did chose, but that option is not for the faint of heart. And I think that there is something that we can learn from the Sabbath about how we navigate through that grief and fear. Adam, Sierra, and I have been doing this Sabbath Innovation Lab with the 1001 worshiping communities. And it's been about trying to inspire us to learn more about the Sabbath and have a Sabbath practice in our own life. And I am absolutely not one to speak definitively on the Sabbath. I actually kind of feel like I've been failing out of the Sabbath lab, to be honest. But one thing that I have kind of repeatedly reflected on is about how the Sabbath, and kind of what Adam was talking about earlier, is that the Sabbath is a day for rest and reflection, not so that we prepare ourselves to do more work or because it will make us a better worker for the next day. The Sabbath is about rest and reflection because for us as humans, that's part of the human experience, and that's part of what we need. It's part of what God intended for us and wanted for us. God themselves rested when they were making the world. And so we too are supposed to rest alongside God. And so in many ways, for me, the Sabbath is about trying to be present, which is hard for me because I'm never present. I'm always planning. I'm always thinking about the next day. I'm always thinking about what I need to do. I'm always making checklists. I'm always worrying. But on the Sabbath, we're supposed to be taking a breath, and we're supposed to be taking a pause to honor God and to honor ourselves. And so I think actually there's a deep significance that we're supposed to be thinking about, knowing that the Sabbath fell on the day after Jesus's death. Because after Jesus died, the disciples didn't get their stuff together and start, getting organized and like, whatever. They didn't, because actually, first of all, it was just against their religious code to do so. And then also, how would they be able to do that, right? With the grief and with the shock. But instead, they had to take a pause and reflect and mourn before they could think about moving forward. In the Catholic Church, during the Eucharistic prayers, one of the things that the congregation does is they pray for those who have fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection. And in many ways, I think that's what this day is supposed to be about. It's actually not yet about celebrating the resurrection. It's not about celebrating the world that we've built or that we're building, but it's about sitting with the understanding that we have not yet been able to bring that world about. And because of that, there are so many people in our lives, in our family, and our movement family, our ancestors, who have fallen asleep before we were able to build God's kingdom here on earth. And so before we jump forward to celebrating ourselves and our movements and our churches, we have to take pause and we have to reflect and mourn that we have not yet been able to bring about that resurrection. We have to mourn that we have been working and waiting and hope for the resurrection. And sometimes it doesn't feel like it's ever going to come. And sometimes we feel paralyzed by the enemy before us. And sometimes it feels impossible to get up and regroup and try again to organize. And so tonight, I think one thing that I think would be good for all of us to do on here, but then also off of here, is to take some time to talk with those who have fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection. I invite us all to stop moving and pushing and planning just for a few minutes and to sit down and think about and pray about and actually talk to those in our lives who have passed on. Take the opportunity to share with them how you're feeling, share with them what we're doing, right? Share with them that you love them and that you miss them and that you think of them and that they're on your mind and on your heart. Things are always going to be moving and we will always have a million things to do. But it is necessary for ourselves and for our movement and for those that came before us to intentionally take the time to pause and to reflect and to pray. And to ask ourselves too, what are moments where we underestimated the enemy before us? Where did we fall short in fighting for the resurrection? And who in our lives or in our traditions have fallen asleep before we could bring about the promise of God's resurrection? This reflection is not something that we do if we have the time, or it's not something to do just so we can be better at our work or just so we can be well rested to get back into it the next day. It's something that we have to do because we're human and we need to foster these periods of connection and rest because that's part of what makes us human. We need to feel the shock and the grief and the weight of the world that we feel as revolutionaries. That doesn't mean we have to let it paralyze us, and that doesn't mean that it has to stop us, but we also can't ignore it either. We can't ignore the gravity of what we have tried to do or what we have failed to do or what we are still fighting to do. And we cannot forget and ignore those who we did not bring about the resurrection in time for.